Yeah, so the Caribbean has a little bit of a gang problem. And by a bit, I mean there are places with killing fields like what you would expect to see in 1970s Cambodia. Except this time, my friends, it's not being operated by a genocidal communist state. No, instead, they are the private playgrounds of gangs competing with one another for territory and terrorizing the population. Now, when I go and explain this, the thing that typically comes to people's mind when talking about gangs in the Caribbean is they think of Haiti. In recent years, Haiti has made headlines for just unprecedented levels of gang violence, with gangs increasingly challenging state authorities and expanding their grip over Port-au-Prince metropolitan area and well beyond that now, which is something that is causing intense pain and frustration for civilians. The reason that is probably even in your mind in the first place is because I have myself done several videos on the subject, and I will need to do a return for an update, but just as a quick update on that, the problem in Haiti has not gone away with the arrival of Kenyan police forces. As it stands, around 90% of the capital city of the country is under the control of these gangs, which is, of course, absolutely terrible, yet this worsening security situation is not something that is just confined to Haiti. Other countries and territories in the Caribbean, especially Jamaica, Puerto Rico, and Trinidad and Tobago, have all experienced a surge in gang violence in recent years, and at this point, it really shows no sign of stopping or even slowing down. In order to understand the severity of what it is that I'm talking about, you need to comprehend that the Caribbean is currently home to 5 of the top 10 most homicidal countries in the entire world. And no, I'm not kidding about that. For just a simple example, in 2022, the homicide rate for Turks and Caicos would climb above 77 per 100,000 people, which was, mind you, a doubling of the previous year. Jamaica's murder rate also climbed to 52.9 per 100,000 people, with 70% of all documented homicides being connected to criminal organizations. St. Lucia's homicide rate would climb to 42.3 per 100,000 in 2022, which is something that would shatter its own previous record from the previous year. And in that same year, Trinidad and Tobago's homicide rate would rise to 39.4 per 100,000, up over 22% from the year before. Mind you, 39 out of 100,000 doesn't really sound like a lot, but an epidemic of violence is considered to be 10 per 100,000. These numbers are 4 to 7 times that, and for perspective, the USA currently sits at around 6 per 100,000, even with all the trouble that you will see in some cities with gangs. Rivalries over criminal activities in the Caribbean are something that are quite intense and fueled by weapons proliferation and transnational drug trafficking. This is something that leaves civilians caught in the crosshairs, both figuratively and also quite literally. Gun violence is something that has only escalated in recent years, and despite various crime reduction measures taken by the respective states, lasting results have not managed to be achieved, and the people of the respective countries are naturally quite upset with their governments, spurring rapid political changes and reforms, the likes of which, who can really say what the results of them will be in the next several years? So my friends, to that end, this video is going to be doing 2 things. First, we're going to be taking a look at the overall history of gangs in the Caribbean and how things got so bad. The second part, we'll be looking at the respective countries of Jamaica and Trinidad and Tobago. I am not going to be doing Puerto Rico specifically in this video because that is probably going to need to be a separate deep dive in and of itself, and I do not want this video to be 2 hours long because, oh dear God, I have so many things I have to make. Either way, get ready for a messy and wild ride, my friends, because we are going to dive right in. But hey, speaking of things that go boom, how about you make things go boom yourself? Today's sponsor, War Thunder. Yeah, you see what we did there? My friends, I absolutely love War Thunder. It is easily the most comprehensive vehicle combat game ever made, and is available for free on PC, consoles, and mobile devices. This is a game in which you can take command of over 2,500 tanks, planes, helicopters, and ships of 10 major nations, ranging from little biplanes and armored cars of the 1920s all the way to modern fighter jets and main battle tanks. With absolutely intense combat, incredibly detailed vehicles, realistic graphics, and authentic sound effects, this is something that puts you right in the midst of some of the most powerful war machines that have ever existed. When you go and sign up, you join a worldwide community of over 70 million players in epic PvP battles. With so much content left to discover in the game, there is really nothing that is better suited for fans of military history, especially for the people who watch things on this channel. This is something that probably appeals to you, I'm guessing. Just as a heads up, this is also something that different people within my community will play in the Discord. This is something that we have fun regularly doing. And so if you go click the links down in my description, whether you are a new or returning player, whether you play on PC or on console, you can get access to a massive bonus pack. This bonus pack will give you multiple premium vehicles as well as an exclusive vehicle decorator, the Eagle of Valor, along with 100,000 silver lions, as well as 7 days of premium account. Play War Thunder using my link, and I will see you all here on the battlefield. To begin, the history of gang violence in the Caribbean is something that is very complex. It's not a very simple story, it's a multifaceted issue. Something that spans several decades when referring to the actual gangs, and technically speaking, if you really wanted to go into detail, centuries when looking at the underlying factors that contributed to it in the first place. Yeah, don't look at me like that. I know my reputation here on the internet for long-winded stories. I get it. Just focus on my cat and hear me out. Because in order to understand the current situation, it really is essential to examine the historical context and the factors that have contributed to the rise of gang violence in the region. Firstly, we are going to have to address the colonial legacy issue. Some people may go and dismiss this outright as it goes back quite far, and to some this may be politically undesirable, but it is still something that is necessary to point out in order to really understand things. The Caribbean region has a long history of colonialism, which is something that has had a lasting impact on the various social, economic, and cultural fabrics of the varying different islands. As many of these economies were extractive in nature with a racial hierarchy, this is something that would contribute to the different issues that would develop on the islands. Poverty, inequality, social exclusion, all of which would create an environment in which gangs could later thrive with the right conditions. Now, from the very get-go, I do not want people to think that this is some kind of political statement that I am making here, because really it is not. Colonies typically had poorer populations. This is true, and poverty is a massive factor for crime. It's really just that simple. Following independence, many Caribbean countries would face significant economic challenges, including high levels of unemployment, poverty, and severe inequality. These conditions that I just spoke about would be something that would create an environment in which young people, in particular, would become disillusioned with their lack of opportunities and could then be turned to more extreme ideologies, as could be seen in many places across the Caribbean and even Latin America. This is what leads to the rise of semi-fascist or communist movements all throughout the region, and at the same time that that is happening with extreme ideologies, you will also see local gangs arise as a means of survival and identity for varying populations. And what is so terrible about all of that is that, typically speaking, as these varying different extreme ideologies took root, they would also become intertwined with local gang activity. Since Latin American countries would achieve independence, the contentions between different political factions would sometimes result in episodes of murder, crime, and civil war, oftentimes this being tied with local militia or gang groups. In Colombia, the period called the violence between 1948 and roughly 1960 is a pretty prominent example of exactly that. Guatemala's civil war from 1960 to 1996 would cause the death of thousands of people, massive displacement of the population, a majority of which were indigenous Mayan people, as well as severe economic disruption and exacerbating existing inequalities, something that greatly weakened local institutions, aiding the rise of criminal gangs. On that note, the last one that I'm going to mention here is likely going to be El Salvador's Civil War, something from 1979 to 92, which is something that led to thousands of deaths. After the Civil War ended, the militarization of civil society, the return of displaced youth who had formed gangs in the United States, the weakness of the state in parts of the country, and the lack of economic opportunities left by war would contribute to the emergence of something called pandillas. For clarification on that, pandillas were things that originated typically as autonomous neighborhood self-defense groups or militias, which with time became criminal organizations that would specialize in extortion and territorial control. These, in turn, would wreak havoc upon the country, and for decades, gangs controlled large parts of El Salvador. And that, my friends, that I just mentioned there about the deportations, that is a crucial thing that has to be mentioned because it is a crucial element for many of the countries that are involved. The deportation of gang members from the United States is something that is highly relevant for today, as I'm sure that many of you have probably seen in the news. This is not anything that is new. Partly as a response to the involvement of immigrant populations in drug trafficking and other illegal gang activities, large-scale deportation of Central Americans began in the mid-1990s. With the passage of the Illegal Immigrant Reform and Immigrant Responsibility Act, the IIRIRA, in 1996, any alien who served a longer than year sentence became subject to deportation from the US after completion of their prison term. This, as you can imagine, would increase deportation rates, but that is something that would only increase further in the 2000s after 9/11 and the subsequent Patriot Act. This would then include non-legal residents, both with and without prior criminal records. The reason why that is then relevant is that over the entire 17-year period from 1997 to 2015, El Salvador would receive a total of 244,000 deportees, more than 90,000 of which, or roughly a third of them, which is about 1.5% of the entire population of El Salvador, had previously been convicted for a crime. As you can likely imagine, this would greatly help to increase crime rates in said countries that these criminals were being deported to. As just an example of one of the countries that we're focusing on here for the purpose of this video, around 4,000 deportees were returned to Trinidad and Tobago alone by the mid-2010s. And you need to understand, the export of hardened criminals connected with international networks is something that generates negative impacts in the destination criminal markets that they are going to. Many of these deportees were specifically equipped with advanced criminal skills and connections that they had built up over the decades of being within the United States. Oftentimes, at that point, their skills would exceed the capacities of local police forces across the region, particularly as more and more of them began to flood in. This would in turn contribute to a kind of deportation model of gang formation, where groups of ethnically similar deported men would form gangs together as they came back into their countries. What is important to note, though, when I talk about this, is that deportees with narco-related skills, like those that were affiliated with drug trafficking, tended to not necessarily get as involved with street-level local petty gang activities, or egregious form of gang-related violence. Instead, these would typically leverage Colombian and Venezuelan connections, where the big drugs came from. And some of these criminal actors would then mobilize to develop more direct contact with suppliers to ship drugs and firearms, creating their own drug empires. That is a problem that would only grow worse with time, because that's just it, my friends. A key driver of the criminal markets and gang activities that we are talking about here is the drug trade, especially cocaine and cannabis. Despite efforts to crack down in the mid to late 2010s, record-breaking cocoa production in 2020 and 2021 would contribute to surging trafficking of cocaine from Colombia, as well as Bolivia and Peru. This is not a new thing, mind you. I've talked about it a couple times before when speaking about Colombia's history, but it is certainly something that has now gotten worse. During the 1980s, Colombian cartels would move an estimated 15 tons of cocaine daily from South America to the US. Indeed, more than 3/4 of all cocaine seized between South America and the US during this period was intercepted specifically in Caribbean countries. Of course, because of this presence, it means that police forces are going to increase efforts to specifically target these locations. And after interdiction efforts were stepped up by the US in the late 80s and 90s, Caribbean cocaine shipments were temporarily disrupted. Reduced, but not quite gotten rid of entirely. To put this into perspective of just how effective these crackdowns were, by 2010, the proportion of US-bound cocaine that was going through the Caribbean would drop to only around 10%, that being from 75% that it previously had been. However, that wasn't going to remain the case. In 2013, cocaine flow to the United States via the Caribbean reportedly reached its highest level in a decade again. Drug interdiction efforts in Mexico and Central America, including various different US-led initiatives, may have been behind this shift, as by cracking down throughout Central America, it forced different traffickers back into the Caribbean route. In 2020, the US Drug Enforcement Administration would estimate that around 24% of all cocaine movement in the Western Hemisphere was passing through the Caribbean Sea. Additionally, cocaine production would be surging, with Colombia as just an example of this, recording a 43% increase in cultivation of coca in 2021, allowing for even more gangs to take it to market. The COVID-19 pandemic and the shutting down of many economies and the depression that many people spiraled into didn't really help this surge in drugs. As a result, my friends, the Caribbean would thus become a major drug transit hub, reaching its highest trafficking levels in decades. Jamaica's strategic location in particular is something that makes it a key transport location, with very convenient access from Colombia and Central America, as well as direct flights to the US, Canada, and the UK. Traffickers would be able to exploit various different transport modes, from commercial shipping containers, luxury yachts, private and commercial aircraft, even using just simple human couriers. The trade was booming again. And so it is then, my friends, that we must now break down the individual countries that I mentioned here in order to be able to address their particular issues. The first one, as I just mentioned, being Jamaica. Now, when I go and explain this, Jamaica's history of gang violence is something that is very complex, something that spans over the course of several decades. To understand the current situation, it really is important to understand the historical context and the factors that contributed to the rise of gang violence in it. Because when I say decades, I mean we're talking about going back all the way to the 1960s. In the early years, from the 1960s to the 1970s, Jamaica would gain its independence. This specifically being from Britain in 1962, and the country would then experience a rapid period of modernization and urbanization as more and more people transferred from agriculture to urban work. However, this process also created social and economic disparities, which contributed to the emergence of gangs in these urban areas. In the beginning, before the rise of major drug trafficking, the first gangs in Jamaica were primarily involved in petty crimes, such as theft and extortion, which you would typically see in small, isolated pockets within the urban areas. That, however, was going to change as politics began to be involved. Because what's interesting to note here is that from the 1970s to the 1980s, this is where we would start to see political gangs occur. In the 1970s, Jamaica's two main political parties, the Jamaica Labour Party, the JLP, and the People's National Party, the PNP, began to use gangs as a means of consolidating power and intimidating opponents. These political gangs, known as area leaders or dons, were often armed and violent, and they would play a significant role in the country's electoral violence as different political parties would compete for territory. Really, gangs and politicians were almost one and the same at this point. This problem would get so bad that it would lead to the rise of Shower Posse, a notorious gang from the Kingston neighborhood of Tivoli Gardens, which emerged in the 1980s. This gang was led by Christopher Dudas Coke, who would later become one of Jamaica's most powerful and feared gang leaders. The Shower Posse was involved in a range of different criminal activities, including drug trafficking, extortion, and murder, which with time would gain international connections. As criminal networks began to develop rapidly around the Caribbean, this means that in a central hub like Jamaica, Shower Posse and others were able to gain access to Colombian cartels and West Coast street gangs. These connections enabled Jamaican gangs to expand their operations and engage in even more sophisticated forms of crime, such as drug trafficking, but also money laundering. As this money, as this power, as this influence grew within the gangs over the course of this time period, that in turn would lead to mass violence over the course of the 90s and the 2000s. Gang wars would begin to rip parts of the country apart, as different factions would vie for control of territories and resources. These gang wars were often fueled by political rivalries and were characterized by high levels of violence, including homicides and shootings, in an effort to intimidate either enemy gangs or at the same time, enemy political parties that you were, against? The problem would get so bad that in 2010, the Jamaican government would declare a state of emergency in response to a wave of violence that had swept the country. The state of emergency gave the security forces sweeping powers to detain and search individuals, and it would even lead to the arrest of several high-profile gang leaders, including the one that we mentioned here before, Christopher Dudas Coke. For those of you that are listening to this right now, you need to understand that gang violence, economic troubles, and so much more became so bad in Jamaica that more people in the country of Jamaica wish that they were still a colony of Britain rather than independent. Yes, you heard me right. According to the Gleaner-commissioned Bill Johnson poll of the mid-2010s, 49% of Jamaicans believed that the country would be better off if it had remained a colony of Britain instead of getting independence. Only 27% of Jamaicans disagreed with the statement. Now, it's not necessarily all due to gangs that is happening. There are multiple reasons for this, of course, but nostalgia for the good old days when things were simpler and safer, that is definitely a factor. And as things were getting more dangerous, this feeling would only grow. Because here, my friends, is arguably one of the most important, dangerous, and complicated factors in all the violence that we are discussing here today, something that is shared amongst many different gangs. That danger is the danger of fragmentation. To explain this, in May of 2010, Jamaica would launch the West Kingston Special Operation, something which would manage to dislodge the country's most established and organized criminal entity, the Shower Posse. This, in turn, was something that was followed by an intense crackdown targeting varying different gang leaders across the island. Jamaica's murder rate during this time would plummet from 62 per 100,000 in 2009 to actually only 36, which, yes, that's still really high, but 36 per 100,000 in 2014. It was a huge drop, which is great, right? Well, yes, sort of, initially, but the problem is the crackdown was not sustained, and the decline in murder would thus only be temporary. By 2017, Jamaica's homicide rate was rising sharply once again. Why would this be the case, you may wonder? Well, you see, in the aftermath of the crackdown, when so many of the key leaders of different gangs were taken out, this in turn would cause the varying different gangs to splinter into many more smaller gang groups, which in turn would fight over territory. To put that into perspective, the number of gangs in Jamaica would increase from 191 in 2010 to 381 in 2018. With Kingston and St. Andrew experiencing most of the increases. As the number of gangs increased, so too did the murder rate. They would be well armed, able to virtually grow their own currency through varying different cannabis production, and would then use this to purchase new high-powered weapons. From the late 2010s onward, guns would only increase in relevance and presence across the island. This is something that is extremely important and critical for Jamaica's gang problem because the majority of murders in the country are committed with guns. Between 2010 and 2018, 76% of all murders were committed with firearms, and it is estimated that 97% of gang murders are committed with guns. Guns, which, as I'm going to mention here a little bit later, were oftentimes smuggled out of the United States directly into criminal hands. Of course, when I say all of this, it is not necessarily all doom and gloom. The government would manage to report a 14.5% decline in murder rates between January and June of 2024, compared to the same period in 2023, as well as a 56% reduction in the number of active gangs in May of 2024 compared to the start of the year. The situation, technically speaking, did improve. However, Jamaica still to this day faces one of the highest levels of gang fragmentation in the entire region. And as a result of that, and increased levels of violence that would be seen towards the end of the year, would be forced to declare another state of emergency. You see, on August 14th, 2024, 8 people, including a 7-year-old boy, were killed in separate gun attacks, which is something that prompted the government to declare another state of emergency. The government described the incident as organized crime and an act of terror and pledged to work with partners to address the issue. As for what the security measures that were implemented under the state of emergency included, that would be things like curfews. The government imposed curfews in certain areas, restricting the movement of people and limiting the hours during which businesses were able to operate. They would increase surveillance, with varying different security forces increasing their presence in the affected areas and using more technologies such as CCTV cameras and stop and search operations to try and monitor and limit the movement of people. When anyone was found that could possibly be associated with gangs, they were detained, oftentimes without charges. Security forces were given the power to detain individuals without charge for up to 90 days, which raised serious concerns for political opponents about the potential for human rights abuses and seizures of power. With the military getting involved in this entire operation, the state of emergency was initially declared for a period of just 14 days, but it was later extended for an additional 30 days. The government would argue that the extension was necessary to allow security forces to complete their operations and ensure that violence was brought under control, but the impact upon the people, the community, was intense. Many people were detained without charge during this time, and there were multiple reports of human rights abuses, including allegations of torture and ill treatment of detainees. The curfew would in turn restrict the movement of people and have a significant impact on local economies, with many businesses being forced to shut down during this time, and the government, as a result, faced severe criticism both inside and outside of it, from both the people as well as the opposition. In response to the criticism, the government would argue that the state of emergency was necessary to protect citizens and restore law and order. It would also argue that it had taken steps to try and address the root causes of the violence that people were complaining about, which, of course, means poverty, including investing in social programs and providing support to affected communities. So yeah, something was done, but despite such efforts, violence has continued. Gunfire between officers and gangsters would break out throughout Spanish Town in January of 2025, and at least one business was burned to the ground after police shot dead Othniel Thickman Loban, who they described as a top leader of the One Order Gang. For context, the One Order Gang is something that has long time been considered an ally of the Jamaica Labor Party. Again, this is one of those things where gangs are associated with politicians, and this particular one is believed to be one of the most powerful gangs on the entire island. Really, politics and gangs are unfortunately intertwined. And when I talk about that, Jamaica is not the only one. Moving on from that, we then have to talk about Trinidad and Tobago. For those who are not familiar with it, Trinidad and Tobago, a twin island nation located in the Southern Caribbean, it is something that has a very rich and diverse history. The country was a British colony from 1797 all the way to 1962, and during this period, the economy was primarily based on agriculture, with sugar being the main crop. However, just like what I spoke about here before with economic changes, with the decline of the sugar industry in the late 19th century, the economy began to diversify and the country became a major producer of oil and gas, which, although that really did help the country's economy to grow, poverty, unemployment, and social inequality remain significant challenges. The lack of opportunities and resources in many communities would help to create an environment in which gangs were able to thrive. In the 1970s and the 1980s, Trinidad and Tobago would experience a surge in gang activity, especially in urban areas such as Port of Spain and San Fernando. Just like in the case of Jamaica, Trinidad and Tobago serves as a major transit point for cocaine and cannabis in the Eastern Caribbean. The country has long been affected by drug shipments and trafficking and high rates of violent crime. In fact, when I say high rate of crime, it is actually the 6th or 8th, depending upon what list you look at, most dangerous country on the planet. And actually, that is where my wife's family is from. You may wonder why it is that that is relevant and why am I even bringing that up? Well, it's because her family was forced to flee after people would climb into the hills next to their house and take shots at them while they were swimming in their pool. No, I'm not kidding. Gunmen would literally go into the hills and then try and shoot them while they were swimming in their pool. Now, you may wonder why exactly it is so incredibly dangerous. Why is it that criminal organizations have such a vested interest in the island? Well, that is because these two islands are a bit of a strategic location. The southern tip of Trinidad is just 11 kilometers away from Venezuela. The country's physical proximity to Venezuela and the fact that it's outside the hurricane belt means that year-round shipments are able to occur for both drug trafficking as well as other illegal activities. What is more, strong cultural ties in southern Trinidad with Venezuela have ensured that the coastal region, which includes Iquitos, Cedros, and Moruga, are sites of extensive trafficking of drugs, guns, and migrants that, in turn, often bring the previous two things that I mentioned. When I go to explain this, in order to understand the severity of the issue, there are over 100 different gangs in Trinidad and Tobago. But research shows that they tend to fall under the umbrella of two super gangs that dominate the island. You have the Muslims and Rasta City. Now, when I go and explain that, these names really give an indication that each one of the groups or a gang within each group belong to either Islamic or Rastafarian faiths, respectively. However, gang members vary in religious beliefs, and it's more so by association and territory. However, that being said, the Muslims are typically affiliated with an extremist international Muslim militant group known as Jamaat al-Muslimin. A group which has its own fascinating history that I'm probably going to need to do an explanation of here in the future because members of that group orchestrated a failed coup against the Trinidadian government in 1990, resulting in the loss of 24 lives. Members affiliated with Jamaat al-Muslimin were also involved in an attempted terror attack in 2007 to try and detonate explosives that would destroy JFK International Airport in NYC. On the reverse, as for Rasta City, the gang is something that rose as a kind of resistance to the Muslims, and a bitter rivalry would follow. Even though the two were major rivals, there would end up still being a split within Rasta City into the gangs of 6 and 7 numerically, with the latter faction actually claiming the name of Rasta City for itself. Violence between these groups would get really bad, but thankfully, at least for a time, with the help of the Interagency Task Force, the IATF, and the Trinidadian police, there would be a truce that was negotiated between 6 and 7, with both sides actually promising a ceasefire in 2023. Of course, when I go and explain that, considering that we're talking about gangs, it really is uncertain as to how long this agreement would last in the first place, or whether it will mean any peace at all, or just to try and redirect violence back towards the Muslim Rasta City rivalry. That whole issue remains to be seen. Now, when I go and mention that, there may be something that a number of people might be confused about. Like, hold on, wait, the government, like the police, negotiated a peace treaty between these gangs? Yeah, it did. Unlike hidden or secret gangs that are difficult to find, the gangs in Trinidad and Tobago are not hiding pretty much at all. Gang leaders are recognized by the government as community leaders due to the fact that they provide security and social services to those within the territory that the government simply doesn't really help. One of the major sources of income for the gangs, alongside drug sales and other illegal activities, is government contracts. This is something that allows them to expand their influence and further their legitimacy as basically local lords. Examples of contracts funded by the government include the Unemployment Relief Program, the URP, and the construction-related contracts that pay unemployed citizens for public service, such as construction projects, fixing drains, building, repair, and doing more things like that. These kinds of contracts are taken by gangs, with jobs then being delegated to their members in order to boost revenue as well as increase their legitimacy. In impoverished communities, this is actually a primary source of income for everyday people, with some citizens living in gang territories being unable to move outside of their homes and areas for fear that they're going to be gunned down by an enemy gang that wants their contract. It sounds insane to say, but issues concerning gang borders have literally and figuratively divided families, with family members and friends being unable to visit each other in different gang territories due to the fact that there is just too high of a risk of violence. Protection from one gang means that you might be the target of a rival gang. And it's out in the open. As I said, gang members are not silent about their affiliations, even going and singing about it. For clarification on that, music has a very significant role in the institutionalization of gangs, with a music genre known as Trinidad developing within Trinidad, which uses guns, gang violence, and more in its songs and the imagery of this to openly brag about being gangs. As just an example of this, on February 2nd, 2024, Cayman 6X. For the love of God, I don't know how I'm going to pronounce this name. Editor, put it up here, please. Dakota, thank you. Yes, this. Maybe slap a picture of him so we can see what an interesting character he is. Anyway, this guy was arrested for bragging and professing to being a gang member, singing and using expressive gestures and videos that would incite violence and promote Six Gang, which in turn was found to violate the 2021 Anti-Gang Act within Trinidad. He was not apologetic at all, bragging about his activities. And yet, despite this, he was granted a 40,000 USD bail and continued to make music to this day. Albeit, of course, I say that, he does now have disclaimers in his music that, oh yes, the artist does not promote any gang violence, followed by gun imagery. Like it's one of those things that it's like a disclaimer slapped onto a South Park episode that says none of the people that are in this episode are real. Everything is coincidence. It's like, ah, yes, totally. I get that. Yeah, sure. Really, it is just insane because this music with time has helped to legitimize gang actions. At the same time, has managed to sanctify its leaders, to glorify them. And any attempt of the government to try and regulate gang-related crime or activities or even put a bit of a crackdown upon the people, well, these efforts have largely been ineffective. Laws such as the Anti-Gang Act actually could do more harm than good, as they end up promoting mass arrests for the escalation of violence. For many hopeful gang members that want to make it big in the rap and gang scene, one of the things that is typically done is trying to incite attention, to try and bring attention to oneself through the glorification of these criminal activities in the hopes that they will get arrested, and then since the majority of these arrests do not actually result in conviction, since police and government officials are often bribed, that allows a gang member to get arrested and then immediately re-enter society without consequences, thus improving their street cred. It sounds so incredibly stupid, but this, as you can imagine, just leads to ever greater increasing cyclical violence. And this is something that got so bad that Trinidad is right now, at the time that I'm making this video, in a state of emergency. On December 30th, 2024, the government of Trinidad and Tobago would declare a state of emergency in response to escalating levels of violence. The declaration was made under the Emergency Powers Act, which gave the government the authority to take extraordinary measures to maintain public order and safety. It is something that gave the defense forces the powers of the police, allowing them to detain suspects, conduct searches, to seize property. And the measure would also include a curfew, which restricted the movement of people in certain areas, and the establishment of checkpoints to monitor the flow of traffic. On January 13th, 2025, the Parliament of Trinidad and Tobago would then vote to extend the state of emergency for a further 3 months, as the problem was not going away. The extension was necessary, according to the government, to allow the defense forces to continue their efforts to curb the violence and restore public order. And as I said, that state of emergency is thus supposed to last until April of 2025. It is occurring right now, just as the government is in the midst of a shakeup, and I am making this video. Like, at the time that I started researching this video, none of these events that I'm describing here had taken place. It is quite literally as I was preparing to film that I then saw, oh yeah, the new Prime Minister, Stuart Young, would then take office on March 17th, 2025. Like, yeah, Trinidad would get a new prime minister during this time, and he immediately declared that early elections were going to take place in April. This move is something that is seen as a bit of a strategic effort to try and secure his own mandate in the Caribbean island nation, which is famous for political turnovers and things not exactly remaining stable. The opposition parties in Trinidad and Tobago have reacted to the announcement with a bit of surprise and also criticism. Some leaders have accused the government of attempting to manipulate the electoral process in order to gain an unfair advantage, while others have welcomed the opportunity to go to the polls and challenge the ruling party. That party, my friends, is the People's National Movement, the PNM, which is something that has been in power since 2020 and is seeking to maintain its grip on the government while dealing with the gang violence, poverty, migration crisis from Venezuela, and much more that has been wreaking havoc across the country and its finances. In fact, I say that here, I'm probably going to need to do some kind of video on Trinidad's very interesting political situation in the future, because if you think that some political groups are divided by race, oh, that's Trinidad. Either way, in the end, the growing power of gangs in the Caribbean and Latin America is something that is undermining the rule of law. It is creating an environment that, with time, is only going to lead to further chaos. Large flows of illicit cash have led to massive rises in money laundering, often involving state actors, police, and politicians or financial elites, as these individuals are tied to gangs in local areas, further weakening state institutions. As legal employment shrinks and government services collapse, gangs go and exploit the void by offering financial aid and some semblance of security in areas under their control, just as they have done in Haiti, while then simultaneously extorting and terrorizing the population. The most extreme example of this, as I just mentioned, has been seen in Haiti, something that, again, we have already covered before and will need to do an extensive update on. The countries that we have just covered are on this same path, though, obviously, that all being said, they are not nearly as far gone as Haiti is. Unfortunately, this creates a bit of a self-perpetuating cycle. People that are desperate for stability and jobs get drawn into criminal organizations, which in turn end up affecting the private and public sector, which leads to more negative consequences, further job losses, which in turn creates the desire for more stability and jobs as chaos and violence ensues. Whether or not things are going to get better is really hard to say. Few places have been able to replicate the success of El Salvador, a nation that we already covered this past year and how it has massively turned itself around to the point that it is actually importing gang members from the United States just to throw them in prison. Of course, when I talk about that, some people go and point to the United States as a possible driver behind mounting gang violence in Latin America and the Caribbean, citing two main reasons. First, the US is the largest market for narco traffickers, which, cocaine, cannabis, everything else like that. It is naturally expected that the wealthiest country in the Americas is going to want to purchase these things. And second, America is the primary source of guns that are arming the gangs. Not through an effort by the CIA, mind you. I need to stress that here right now. I know that there are going to be some people in the comments that are saying that this is a deliberate action, when instead, the majority of what is typically happening is that people are going and illegally obtaining guns and then smuggling them out of the country, or they are buying them legally through strawman purchases in which they buy the guns legally and then proceed to sell them illegally, smuggling them out of the country. As it stands, my friends, really the age of piracy might be long dead in the Caribbean. But the gangsters of the Caribbean, well, those may just be rising. With that, my friends, we're going to be ending things here today. Thank you all very much for watching. I appreciate you all. Remember to go ahead and like, comment, subscribe if you can. And considering everything that I have that is going on here in my life, especially over the course of the next month, I don't know what that means for the content that I'm going to be creating, whether I'm going to be making enough videos, if anything is going to happen to them. There's a lot of stuff that is going on. So if you want to support me, I really do appreciate it. When I say that, you don't have to buy things that I ask you to. You don't have to buy my coffee. You don't have to go and buy my merch. You don't have to do these things. It is appreciated when you do, but even doing something as simple as liking and commenting, interacting with the video in order to drive the algorithm to push these things further, all of that is appreciated, and I thank you, my friends. Thank you, and I will see you next time. Goodbye, everyone.